In the last video, we were talking about how horrific Gettysburg was. 100,000 men lost their lives there. And how the nation really paused and said, this is holy ground, these lives lost. This is something we need to acknowledge, memorialize. And we talked about that they were, on these stages, people would just get up and they would speak for hours. Lincoln spoke after a famous orator spoke, and he spoke for about 2 hours. And then Lincoln stood up and he spoke these few words that says, excuse me, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And then the president sat down. Now, as we talked about after Gettysburg, in the retreat of the South into the South, back into Virginia, Sherman, General Sherman for the North, was in charge of coming down in the West and marching through and finally kind of taking, doing a major offensive and, in a sense, really kind of stopping this war, having it end, be the final straw. And so as Sherman and his army began to march through from the west, they came to places like Chattanooga and Atlanta, and they had a policy of within 50 miles of the troops fighting or the troops marching, 50 miles was going to be scorched earth. They destroyed, they took, they burned cities, and their idea was to take away what few resources the South had to stop the war. And so Sherman marched through Atlanta, absolutely destroyed Atlanta, burned it. He gets to the sea. He attacks Savannah, and all this is destruction, nothing but destruction. And he decides, now it's time for me to turn north and go back into Virginia and take the capital. As he goes north, he still is destroying everything around him. He gets to Columbia, deals with that city, continues to march up, and one of the final battles was in Bentonville, North Carolina. Sherman shows up with his troops. The South really kind of makes a final stand, and they lose. This is Atlanta, a picture of Atlanta. Remember, photography, it was one of the new technologies that was just coming on the scene, and there were embedded reporters that actually traveled following the troops and being there at the battles. Very similar to what we see today. And so these reporters took pictures of what was going on. And here's the city of Atlanta destroyed by fire. Finally, as I showed you on that map, Sherman is going up and he hits South Carolina, Columbia, and he goes to Bentonville, North Carolina. They get up into Virginia, and Grant hears that Lee is up there, and Lee went to flee. They attacked Richmond. They captured the southern capital. Richmond, Virginia was the southern capital of the Confederacy. And Lee, their famous general, is fleeing Richmond. The Northern General Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, pursues Lee, and he captures him at Appomattox in Virginia. And Lee surrenders with very dignified, and they treated each other with a lot of dignity. Grant allowed the rebel soldiers just to go home. They didn't capture them, they didn't try them or charge them with anything. And that action there, when the Southern Army finally said, we're done, we have lost, we will surrender. How Grant treated the Army is very much how Lincoln wanted the North to approach the South. And Lincoln announced, we would have malice. And malice is hatred, intense hatred, or an anger towards none. Meaning, the victorious North would not take any revenge on the South. There's no payback. There was too much pain and anguish on both sides. There's no payback with this. After he's made that speech, after the war was officially over, and they're starting to plan, how do we put the country back together? Lincoln is assassinated while at the theater 5 days later. The amount of casualties on both sides is pretty astounding. You have 1.5 million men on the side of the North and a little over 1 million on the South. You see wounded, non-mortally, so they did recover, quite a few there. Death from wounds. Remember, there were no antibiotics. They didn't understand bacteria and viruses. And so their death rates were sort of close. Their death from disease. Again, we talked about earlier in the videos what it was like in the camps and the unsanitary conditions and what they had to deal with. So disease spread rapidly. And then the death rate. And you can see that the death rate for the South was bigger, and proportionately, compared to the number of soldiers, it was a higher rate. Now, one of the main factors for the high death rate for both sides is that they died from infection. This is an example of a field hospital. They wore the apron, they would pull the soldier, put them on the table, the surgical table. Many times there was no anesthesia. They used ether for anesthesia. If they didn't have ether, they would try to pour whiskey down them. If they did not have whiskey, the surgeon's assistants, and there would be 4 or 5 of them, would just hold the person down while they amputated their limbs. And then what they would do, after they would amputate the limb and they would tie it off to cut off the blood flow and get it to begin to heal, they just threw the limbs out in a pile outside of the surgical tent. They would take that guy off the table. The surgeon would just literally take the saw, kind of wipe it on his apron, and wait for the next patient. So the surgical procedures and conditions were really, really horrific. But it was not unusual to see a lot of arms and legs piled up by these tents. Civil War deaths compared to our deaths in the other wars. We far outnumbered in the Civil War. 620,000. In World War II, with much more significant weapon power, 318,000. World War I. The War of 1812, look at the Revolutionary War. The amount of casualties and death was just horrific. And remember, these are people's dads and brothers, and so to deal with this, there is much pain and grief on both sides. Important Civil War battles and events, we will be covering these, but really understand, and most of all understand the order, the chronological order that they happened, very important. And where was North Carolina in this? North Carolina fought early in the battles, but most those battles were in Virginia. North Carolina participated in those battles in Virginia. There were a lot of blockade runners down there, and Bentonville was that last major battle for North Carolina. Now our big question is, now that it's over, but the leader is dead, what should the southern states do to be allowed back in the sense family or the Union? What should happen to Southerners who rebelled? Is there a consequence for that? And what should it be? So the leaders of the Southern Rebellion, do they incur some sort of punishment? And what should happen to the newly emancipated slaves? Here's thousands and thousands of men, women, and children. Many have no skills. Many are not able to read or write. How do we help these newly freed people? That will be coming up next in the next series.